Welcome to the March meeting of the Historical Society. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Carolyn Adams, and her subject is Soldier Ladies, South Australian Nurses in the Boer War. Carolyn graduated as a registered nurse at the Royal Adelaide Hospital before gaining an associate diploma in social work from the South Australian Institute of Technology. After working in aged care, she studied for a diploma in dance, there's variety for you, and then taught in a variety of studio and workshop settings. Undertaking further study, she received her Bachelor of Arts degree in History at Griffith University and graduate diploma in Humanities and Master of Letters from University of New England, where her thesis centred on Australian nurses in World War I. Her PhD thesis at Monash University was entitled "So Give 3 Cheers for Our Sisters," focused on Australian nurses in the Boer War. Her research interests include the history of medicine, nursing and public health, and church history. She's worked both in academia and on private projects. So welcome, Carolyn, and we'll invite you to address us. Thank you.
Okay, well thank you very much for asking me, and I'm going to tell you about South Australian nurses in the Boer War. Now, first of all, before I go into that, I think it's really important to look at some of the background. So we're going to start off with nursing in Australia. For a while, it was very, very poor nursing until Lucy Osborne came to the Sydney Infirmary. In 1863, Lucy Osborne was sent by Florence Nightingale to the Sydney Infirmary to reform nursing. And what she found there really is very telling of the type of old, unstructured nursing that was happening. And these are some of the things that were said. You know, dirty, frowsy old women, untidy young ones, and they were selfish, and rags. And if you ever get to read a book by Judith Godden called Lucy Osborne, she gives a very good description of life in Sydney Infirmary, and you wouldn't get out there alive, I don't think. Like from 1868 to 1899, only about 30 years, nursing is instantly reformed within 30 years, so that you get modern nursing. and one of the ways that they had to reform modern nursing was to restructure it as a middle class. So it became middle class, it became clean. And one of the ways that is very obvious is in the nurses' uniform, and this comes very much to the fore with the South Australian nurses. The visual becomes very, very important, and we'll go through that a bit later on. And the other thing I wanted to say about that was, at the end of the 19th century, nurses were more than the nice, kind, middle-class ladies. They were also bringing a set of skills and some knowledge, which were very important. Okay, so in 1869, in October, war broke out between the British Empire and the Transvaal. And there was a call to arms, and the colonies were very quick to respond. And I think by the end of October, the first troops from the South Australian colony were departing. Very quick response. And as part of that, there were the patriotic funds, the funds to raise money for the troops. And taking their lead from Sydney, a lot of the South Australian nurses decided to get together and to have this patriotic fund, this collection fund. The response to that fund really says an awful lot about reform nursing, about South Australia, or the colony of South Australia, and also the different roles, the different gender roles between men who went to war and the women who looked after the sick. And it all comes about very nicely, that I found. What they talk about are are how the nurses are dressed. The uniform becomes very important. And, so much alleviation of the sick. These are the people who should be collecting funds. People can't not give to them. City men, who've given before. But, there's a nice, pretty little nurse. Let's give them some more money. So the nurses become these kind of patriotic angels. And again, what the paper says are what they look like. So they've got a red cross, they've got badges, they've got baskets, and the self-denial. This is all this kind of sort of angels and ladies and everything else. So it all comes to what they're saying here, and there's a strong sense of patriotism. This is very important, that we are South Australian and that we're patriotic. So I'm just sort of setting the scene for how the nurses were viewed, because it comes together rather nicely. When, again, the papers are writing, they write in a very gendered manner. It won't be pleasant work. But their uniform, again, here it comes, their uniform should bring home to us all that, as nothing else could, the need to help. And then we go into a nice gendered role thing. Men fight, women look after the sick. So this is in December of 1899. And at that time, although there'd been this ladies' committee formed, there was no real chance of nurses going to the Boer War. And there are various reasons for that. They didn't think, the British didn't think that it was probably necessary. They had their own war idea of nurses, so that the nurses were the supervisors and orderlies looked after the patients. And so by the end of 1899, they really didn't see a need for sort of a lot of overseas nurses. But, the second contingent is about to depart, and there begins to be calls, people saying, well, shouldn't we send nurses or doctors? In late January, they get the call. This is it. This is the telegram that they've been waiting for, that they will take 6 nurses. They'll be under the imperial structure, but they will take 6 nurses. And this immediately has a flurry of activities. They've got to get uniforms, they've got to get funds, they've got to get ship accommodation. So all of this happens very, very quickly. On the selection panel for, who's going to come, there are no nurses on the board. It was suggested that maybe a couple might be on the board, but none actually got to select the nurses. And Martha Bidmead, who was the leader of the contingent, she didn't get a say who came and who didn't. So it was selected by doctors, and this brings us back to the idea of nurse as handmaiden to the doctor. Even though matrons were running hospitals, choosing their own staff, when it came to this, they decided doctors were the best people to choose nurses. But there were other compensations. And the chosen nurses. This is written by a Lady Tennyson, wife of Lord Governor Tennyson. The criteria was suitable training, so in mostly 3 years, experienced, mature, and they must be able to mobilise fairly quickly because they were leaving in February. And Lady Tennyson says, I'm so happy to hear that they're all over 30 and the head one is 34. Now, the funny thing about this is that in a later address, Lord Tennyson is talking about how nice it is to have young, sweet nurses. Were they over 30? So the nurses, I've just put them up there. Martha Bidmead, she's from the Adelaide Children's Hospital, trained at Wakefield Street, and she was charge nurse in the country, and so forth, and so forth. That OP stands for outpatients at Wakefield Street. But Sister Hill, Miss Tibbets and Lady Tennyson were able to choose the uniform. Is that good? Now, I think that there is a connection between Sister Hill, who is at the Children's Hospital, and Miss Tibbetts. I've got a feeling that they might be sisters-in-law or something like that. So this is their uniform, and, you know, importantly, they are South Australian trained nurses. None of this other colonial stuff, they're South Australian. We don't want to get mixed up with Victorian nurses or, heaven forbid, Western Australian nurses. We are South Australian nurses. Here again, the newspapers have a field day. What do they look like? Doesn't matter how experienced they were or, you know, whatever. They want to know what they look like. So they're pretty and striking, but subdued, which is only fitting. Their red-lined coats that once proclaimed their office. You know, but in saying that, what does all of that say? And there are various other quotes. It's saying that the uniform is very important because it gives them the passport to the military life. And it's middle class. It's very middle class. They've got, you know, cloaks, and they've got other things. It's very middle class, and it's very feminine, and it's South Australian. We know that because there's a big border thing that says South Australian. They're wearing the Chantelines, the SATN. This photo speaks 1,000 words. The Chantelines, which they're wearing, is a little bag with nurses' tools. And it comes down from when the lady of the house had the keys to the wine cabinet. So it's a very lady thing. It's something ladies have. They're very elegantly dressed for nurses, but, you know, it's a very middle-class pose. These are middle-class ladies, and they're in a middle-class pose, and it looks kind of drawing room. So it kind of situates them within a very middle-class, ladylike environment. And think back 30 years prior, nurses were the dirty, frowsy old women. You've come a long way, baby, you know, in 30 years. Okay. Now, one of the really funny things which I found was that the nurses had to take part in a fundraising concert. And it was very jingoistic. And the great and the good were there. The governor was there, Lady Tennyson, this person, that person. And there's a lot of kind of empire stuff happening. And these 6 women who are about to set sail for foreign shores to a war zone are asked to take part in these tableaus. And they're off to war in the Transvaal, etc., etc. So I just think it's a very quirky little thing about why would they take part in these tableaus. And I guess what I've come up with is the idea that they're front and centre. They're in the public eye and they know the value of some PR. That's going to help them. So their farewell was again extremely interesting. So they were given parties and send-offs and lots of other stuff. Yeah. And it's a very different farewell. When you think that in October and in January, you had soldiers marching down the street, and there are some photos of these mass crowds in King William Street. It's all very military, and soldiers are marching by. This is a very different farewell, and it's probably one that hasn't been done before because they don't know how to farewell nurses because they've never been farewelled before. So the papers remark that it's a very different farewell. So the nurses, just before 4 o'clock, in their pretty costumes, you see, we're back to our costumes again, our pretty costumes. They go into Parliament House and they sign the agreement to serve. And they also have a cup of tea, afternoon tea. And so again, the papers go to town, and I'm sort of going through a lot of this because it really sets the scene. And so again, we have the very gendered roles. You know, the role of a soldier is dangerous, but nursing's onerous. And look, it's so gendered. True womanly sympathy, allied with courage. So, and why I think this is so important is because at the turn of the century, there is so much sort of anxiety about gendered roles. You have the vote. Victoria was still having sort of dramas about it. And it has to do with sort of women as being active citizens. And this is a very real way that women can be seen as being active citizens. Only 6 of them. But they also had a support network behind them. And I think it's very important that this little this group of 6 women, is seen as sort of active citizenship. And so the lady Beres does actually comment on this. And citizenship to do with Australia and the Empire. And the Empire is all important. Things like braving the perils of the horrors of war. And our women are taking an active share in that. I think it's very important. So after they've come out of Government House, out of Parliament House, this is kind of Spice Girls stuff. There are throngs of people, and they're all trying to clamour to see them, and they're surging towards them. They get to the railway station, and people are in the carriages, and they're apparently lining the platform, and it was very difficult for the nurses to actually get in the train. But I just think it's a lovely one. Throngs of women shrieked and almost fainted. Everyone pressing for a look. It's sort of pop star stuff. And the women, the nurses themselves, just took it in their stride. And Martha said to me, yes, well, but our work hasn't begun yet, really. She just said, well, there's other hard work to do. This is just nothing. And this is, I think, lovely. They were given a bouquet of roses of England and violets typical of womanly modesty. Isn't that sweet? So, although these nurses are going off to war, it is a very gendered gift. Flowers. And they also had chocolates in national colours, because we're patriotic, and we're patriotic angels, you see. And I did read that they got on the train and they got up to the hills, where they got off to have afternoon tea. As you do. Now, they went by train to Melbourne and caught the Australasian to Cape Town. Now, most of them suffered dreadfully from a seasickness, except for Nurse Stevenson, who kind of became nurse to them all. And she had a wonderful time. It was like a cruise. There were entertainments and things happening, and we had a jolly good time every night. Yes. Now, the other person on board was also Edith Dickinson. Now, she's a very interesting character. She's some relative of the Earl of Stradbroke, and ostensibly she was going to report on nurses. But it was really to see her 2 sons who were fighting in South Africa. And she gives 1 or 2 very disparaging reports about the nurses, about them being seasick, and about Nurse Stevenson looking after them. And then that's the last we hear of her. And I'll bring her up a bit later on, because she's also important in something else. But yes, interesting character. So when they arrive in South Africa, this is a different world. And they get to Table Mountain, and this is how Martha Bidmead describes it, dream mountains. And that's a lovely sort of a description. But it is a case of strangers in a stranger landscape. They're suddenly thrown into military life, and they're suddenly thrown into a war zone. And it was very different for them. They had to learn how to work with the British military. They had to learn to work in tents. Yeah, it just really was such a different experience, because they were out of their normal hospital settings. My view is that because most of them had worked in Australia, or they had worked in Australia. They were probably more used to more colonial ways of doing things than the English nurses coming from English hospitals, but that's just my thought. So this is very queer work after civilian hospitals. They are first stationed at Wynburg, which is about half an hour outside of Cape Town, by train, according to Martha Bidmead, and it's called the Sanitarium of Cape Town, and they were stationed with the 2 British General Hospital. They were there for about March, April, and they needed to become accustomed to military life, where the orderlies did a lot of the nursing, or bedside care. That's a better way of putting it. So here's Martha Bidmead, very good nurse, and she goes into a tent and she finds enteric, which is typhoid, temperature of 103, and he's just finished shaving. And she, gets a bit upset. In another area, she goes, somebody has just had a wash, and she says something like, "And I didn't know about it either. Fancy that." And she, so they're used to controlling the ward. Here they don't have that. Now, it's partly to do with the sort of tent arrangement, and partly because the orderlies in the British military hospitals do a lot of the patient care, which has its own problems, which I'll come to. This is sort of the crux of a lot of the nursing in the Boer War, and it has to do with the British military. Nurses are seen as the lady nurses, and they're on the periphery. After Nightingale came back from the Crimea and the British military hospitals were established, there were a few what they call Netley nurses. And these few nurses were kind of supervisors, and they might look after the very sick, but they were supervisory capacity. But they couldn't really order the orderlies because they were under their own sergeant. So their role and their function and their status was very iffy. And what they had to do in the Boer War was they had to establish themselves as very good, skilled clinicians. And this is a time when sort of surgery is taking off, aseptic technique, nursing enteric patients, which was seen very much as a nursing concern because there were no medicines that were suitable. So the way to get enteric patients better was very, very good nursing. And this is what these trained nurses could do. They could give very, very good bedside nursing. And they had a knowledge base as well. So they had to sort of compete with the orderlies, who could be very good or very bad. And also, by the time the war is happening, a lot of the good orderlies are at the front, and the orderlies who are in the other hospitals tend to be either sort of other soldiers, convalescent soldiers, or just plain ordinary soldiers who've been drafted in to be orderlies. So they have very few skills. Okay, and the other people that they have to consider are the amateur nurses, the lady nurses. These are people mainly from England who are middle or upper class, and they want to nurse the officers. They don't want to nurse Tommies. They want to nurse the officers. They want to go out to the officer wards, and a lot of them came, swanning out from England, got a nurse's uniform and decided to be nurses. And they were a major hindrance. One guy said that, he had this fractured arm, and she fiddled and fussed about with it, made it worse. And yeah, they were not very good, but they thought that they could, sort of come in and swan about and be ladies. And it did actually come to the attention of the British authorities, and a lot were sent home. Or they said, okay, you can go up to the battle zone, but you can't take your maid. That stopped them, didn't it? That stopped them in their tracks. I must say, though, that there were another group of mainly upper class women who were fantastic, and they became supply lines. These were people, a lady, Roberts is one, they had their own supplies of clothes, food, bedding, whatever, and they were able to bring it up. And one of the factors in looking at sort of Boer War nursing is that there are all of these kind of informal networks to get all of the goods up to the front line. And the military could be very fuddy-duddy about stuff. Stuff went missing, stuff could be in the next train car, but you weren't allowed to use it, etc., etc. The ladies tended to cut out all of that and got a lot of stuff up very, very quickly, and they were very good at it. You know, one of the things was that the doctors and nurses had sort of a similar status, and this is a lovely sort of description where she's, and I can imagine her in a long skirt and so forth, trying to go under the tent ropes and trying to get in and out of tents. And it was, you know, quite a set too. The doctor saying, no, you go first. And she's saying, you're the doctor, you go first. And so, yeah, it's lovely. Quite a set two partner affair. And I sail out with as much dignity. You know, I can just imagine somebody trying to crawl out of the guide ropes. It's lovely. And they, you know, there was any amount of work. And this is a good description of what the nurses did. So OBS, medications, dressings, and they were very skilled in doing very good aseptic technique dressings. Now the Netley nurses who I've talked about before, these were the regular army nurses from Britain. And yes, they did nurse some of the very sick patients, but there was a bit of sort of angst between the regular nurses, who weren't that many, and all of the others. The British nurses who came in through the Queen Alexandra group, any other odd-bod nurses, the colonial nurses, and New Zealand nurses, Canadian and Australian. And I think part of the thing is that for years and years and years, the Netley nurses had struggled. They'd managed along without a great deal of power, without a great deal of influence, and there weren't that many of them. Suddenly, all of these top-notch civilian nurses are thrown in, and they're used to a different setup. So I can understand why there's a bit of tension between them. So the amateur ladies. Yeah, Martha Abidmead has a lovely turn of phrase, I think, sometimes. You know. I saw Mrs. Dick Chamberlain. She was wearing a Canadian nurse's uniform. Why she was wearing it, don't know. As this cape with lace and a haughty expression. I imagine she'll write a book about it. She looks that sort of woman. Yeah, I just think it's lovely. Okay, now this is to General Hospital, and this is taken in May of 1900. So it's about a month after the South Australian nurses left. And it's already got a certain sort of clinical atmosphere to it. So, you know, you do have sort of equipment and bowls there. And it looks kind of tidy. And on the little shelf here, there's actually flowers. So the ward, as it is sort of a lot more civilised. And yeah, it's quite tidy. Yeah, but I came across that, and yeah, to find out that was taken about a month after the nurses left, I thought was fantastic. Most of the nurses arrived March, April, and it was when the typhoid started its sort of next cycle. And by the end of April, there were 5,000 cases of typhoid. This is really horrific, because at that stage there are hardly any nurses up north. So they have to get as many nurses as possible up there. And so they rush them up. But, you know, the nurses, although it was work, it was a great adventure. This is a great girl's own sort of adventure. So, and because they're wearing their uniform, their badge, it gives them the right to go up country. Yeah, so this is a big deal. But in all of that, they go out to the battlefield and they collect shrapnel and stuff, and they're passing through a train, and they say, we feel sure that was where General so-and-so took some gun or something, and so as they're going up, they can see the battlefields and what's happening, and they see it as a great adventure. This is exciting, this is daring. And the funny thing is that when they get up to Bloemfontein, the orders were actually meant for the New South Wales nurses. But, we jumped the claim, we got here first, and so they're really, we got here first, we jumped the claim, we're here. So there's a bit of a rivalry between the nurses. Yeah, so, I mean, they're very sort of ruthless, ambitious women, they really are. They were stationed at Cape Town and Wynburg, and they go up to Bloemfontein. Now, this is important because of how the typhoid comes. Now, I'm not a military historian. Don't ask me about military matters because I don't know them. But although typhoid was usual at this time of year, it comes in cycles, one of the things that made it a lot worse were the flying columns. And that was to get men as high up as quickly as possible. After the sort of initial 3 months, the Boers made many strikes and many towns fell under the Boers. The counter-offensive was to rush men up, and they had these flying squads to get men up as quickly as possible. But in order to do that, they had to leave all of their packs and all of their extra clothes behind. And it was pretty hard going. And they fought various battles along the way before going up to Kroonstad, and they're aiming for Pretoria. Now, when they're in the Mui River, they drink contaminated water. And given the incubation time and given the battles along here, and the battles are every day, every second day, as they're going along, they're dropping down like flies with typhoid. And so you often hear stories of men being left with no clothes, except the wet stuff that they have. They've got no sheets, they've got no blankets, they're exposed for several nights, they've got no water. And so by the time they get to the hospitals in probably up in Kroonstad, around here, which is where a lot of the nurses were, they're in a very, very bad way. And it's up to the nurses to try and get them better. So that is why they needed a lot of nurses up there very quickly. And I read one report by a doctor, and they count the nurses as they come off the train. Oh yes, 3 arrived today, and we're expecting another 2 tomorrow, and they're counting them, yes, come on. And because the situation is so dire, and you get, skeletal men climbing all over each other. Some of the stories are just sort of horrific. So that's why nurses were so important to get them up there. So that's what I've just been talking about. They were very, very bad. And I guess enteric was probably more deadly than the actual war wounds, but that's another story. Very sad. Now, when the South Australian nurses arrive, they're met by Major Fiashi. I think that's how you pronounce it. Now he is known in World War I as well. And he just grabs them. Oh, you're here, this is fantastic. And they were made very welcome by the officers. And one of the phrases which comes about is sort of order out of chaos. And so they had to find either town halls or tents to try and make them into hospital wards. And they begged, borrowed, and stole stuff, I'm sure. Okay. This is a town hall. I'm not really sure where, but you can see the sort of a wallpaper and the rail there, and It's all very fancy, but you notice the bed blocks and a ward round. I'm assuming that's an orderly, doctor and nurse. But it's starting to look like a bit of clinical space. You can see that it's got the outlines of a hospital ward. And so they got what they could from what was there. They got their friends and a lot of the ladies who came with their husbands, like General so-and-so's wife or something. They got them to bring up a lot of stuff. And Lady Roberts apparently came up to some of the other nurses, and she had a lot of luggage. And everybody said, oh yes, Lady Roberts travels with all her luggage. She had one case for herself. The rest were all full of hospital equipment. The Tommies, they tend to be young boys, and they like to mother them and nurse them, and they're nice. And they're sort of, boys, they're lads. And the officers tended to be more of the same social status, and they were possibly around the same age, and they had a good sense of humour between them. They kind of understood each other well. But the great thing was to see South Australian boys. And Samuel Way's son comes, and this is important. They like to see South Australian nurses, and the nurses like to see the boys. And they always try to sort of keep them something, a bit of a treat. Now, this is all important because most of the information I've got from there comes from letters. Now, the letters are extremely important. Most of the letters come into the newspaper, and this informs people about what their nurses are doing, and it tells them about the sort of army life and the boys. But it also is sort of a checks and balances, because South Australian nurses, for some unknown reason, were the only ones who were funded by the colony. Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australian nurses were funded by the imperial government, so they paid their wage. For some reason, that didn't happen with the South Australian nurses. So all of their funding came from the South Australian community. So it was very important that they were seen to be doing a good job, and that they could give back something, that they could tell people this is what's happening. And it was also a way to get some more supplies, because various groups would send over parcels. And there's a lovely one where the children from Uncle Harry's Sunbeams Club. So Uncle Harry and the Sunbeams, they sent over a parcel. So Martha Mead writes back to thank them in the paper. And they often talk about, the treats, the sweets and so forth. But this was very often the only food, the jellies, these were the only food that the men could eat. So they weren't sweet extras. These become vital. And I think that's kind of overlooked, that a lot of the stuff that they're talking about is very important. And there was an awful lot of alcohol being drunk, I'll tell you, because brandy was a stimulant, and that was the only thing that they could have. Champagne also, I don't know why, but there was an awful lot of champagne. And one of the English nurses, she says, I become a dab hand at opening champagne. And one of the soldiers asked if I'd been a barmaid in a previous life. That would have gone down well. Now, later on, some of the nurses moved further up to Pretoria. Nurse Stevenson, we know, worked on a ship, and they all received service medals from the new king. Kind of, by the time 1901 comes, the letters are less frequent and they kind of disperse. So it's sort of a very strange way to finish, but that's the best I can do. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Any questions from the floor?
I don't do military history, so please don't ask me.
Keep away from that. I've got a question I was going to ask you. Yeah. What's the origin of Netley in Netley Nurses?
Netley was a place, I think it's just outside of London. Yes. I think it might be by Aldershot, that whole military complex. or by the Thames, I'm not sure, somewhere there.
So it was a training place for nurses?
It was a military hospital.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Your references to the Adelaide papers, which you looked up, did you have to find them all on microfiche?
Yes.
Hard work.
Yes. This was before Trove.
So some of those are indexed on Trove, are they?
The Adelaide Observer isn't, because I looked at it last night and I couldn't find it. The Advertiser should be, the Register should be, but most of the stuff for Martha Bidmead, I think, comes from the Observer. Mm-hmm. So yes, I've been through them all.
Yes, I've been to a place called Netley.
Oh yes, yeah.
To an Australian war grave there.
Oh, right, yeah.
And this particular place is actually on the south coast, just west of Portsmouth.
Oh, right, okay.
And there is a very large building, three-storey, which was a hospital during World War One. Yeah. So perhaps it might have gone back to the Boer War.
It goes back further. In fact, I think it goes back to the 1860s, 1870s. Now, the point of that hospital building is that it is built on very good lines, so that there's lots of sort of free-flowing air, and that was one of the Nightingale sort of design places, so that there was a lot of ventilation, because they were big on ventilation. Yeah.
Did all the nurses survive, or did some of them succumb to the rampant typhoid?
A few of them did get typhoid. There was only one Australian nurse who did die of typhoid, which was Fanny Hines. But there again, she was left alone, and this is the sort of great sort of inconsistency. Some of the nurses were left alone on these remote stations, and they were looking after patients, and there was nobody else. So they were working 24 hours a day. And yet, at other times, the generals or the colonel said, no, nurses, you can't possibly go for a walk. And one of them said, no, you can't ride horses. You might fall off.
That's true.
This is true. I mean, the thing is, you know, if I ride a horse, I must not fall off. There were some who most of the colonels and generals were very, very nice to the nurses, and they were kind of benevolent fathers, uncles, that type of person, but they kind of took it too far at times. And yet at other times they were sent everywhere else alone, and one nurse was alone looking after 15 patients. But one Victorian nurse died.
No. I was just going to ask, can you tell us how did they treat typhoid?
Okay.
And what was the recovery rate?
When they were nursed, like you can't really say because they were nursed well, they all got better. Typhoid could be treated symptomatically, but they realised that the only real treatment was sort of good nursing, sort of caring for them. And one of the things that they consider is something called the Kimberley diet, which was used by a nurse in Kimberley. She was a South African nurse, and where the old British idea was to starve the patient, the Kimberley diet actually gave people food, and so anything that they could tolerate. So it meant that they were getting fluids in, and they might be getting some sort of beef tea or something with some sort of extra thing in it, beef stock, beef jellies. So they started to actually, get fluid in, because what they didn't realise was that you needed the fluid. So they, by good nursing, looking after their skin care, and also mouth care was very, very important, and the nurses were able to provide that, because the mouth led, if it wasn't looked after, led on to secondary infections, and that was where sort of a lot of people died, and also a lot of people did die from the secondary infection. So as long as they were nursed well, kept in bed, and they were given what fluids or what food they could tolerate, and they also went in weeks, and you hear things like my temperature was down today. If it's down for another day, I can have beef tea. I've been on a beef tea for a week. As long as my temperature stays down, I can have something else tomorrow. So it was a lot to do on sort of clinical observations. When their temperatures came down to normal, they could have some more food. But good nursing care, yeah.
I wonder if you'd say something about two things. One is setting up the ward and the sort of the rules of the ward in a way that hadn't been done before when there were just orderlies, and setting up that sort of regime and how the officers cope with that. And secondly, just a little bit about the last letter issue, which I know you've written about, writing for people.
Okay. You want me to talk about clinical space, which is my favourite topic, so I can talk on this for a long time. How they set up the wards, several issues. First of all, they started to get clinical space. So it had to be clean, and they used to get sort of scrubbing, and they themselves would scrub. They would get doctors scrubbing, making the place clean, because there were bugs all over the place. So it had to be a clean environment. It had to be orderly, so that there wasn't, clothes, bandages, or stuff all over the place. So they created order. They civilised the wards. Now, one of the main things was flies. So they had netting. They brought in netting. They brought covers for cups, because all the milk and all the food was left out. They covered it. So they did a lot of cleaning, prevention, and the times were interesting. Previously, people had wandered in and wandered out. They had visiting hours. No, you cannot visit your friend now. You come back at such a time. So time was very important. They began to structure the day so that they did this, they did that, and then this. So it was structured time and very clean space. And they brought in instruments. The last one I just think is lovely, because it shows the trained nurse as a bedside provider, as a bedside carer. And nursing the dying was something that the nurses did very well. When you read some of the reports from the orderlies, they weren't very nice. People are dying and they're calling out, and the orderlies say, well, come on, now hurry up and die then. Yeah. I think it was partly because it was too overwhelming, partly because they didn't know how else to respond, and also some of the old orderlies from Netley were old soldiers, and they had ways of doing things, and so people copied them. So to have these nurses come in and care for dying people is a big breakthrough, and they're willing to journey with the dying and sit with them, which they do, and they spend hours sitting with dying patients. And there's a lovely story about flowers. There was one person who really liked flowers, so she got him some flowers, and when he died, she put the roses into the coffin, and she took a photo of the tomb, the cross and stuff, and she sent it to his mother, so that the nurses become witnesses for the family, and they write things, which is lovely. And there's another one, again, another rose story, where she put the rose up by the pillow, and so nursing the dying is something that the nurses did very well and very compassionately.
Carolyn, two little points. Major Fiaschi.
Yes.
I presume you might want to tell us all. I mean, he was the New South Wales leader of an actual organised military hospital unit, wasn't he, of the military?
Yeah.
I think
yes.
he was an Australian,
Yeah.
or whatever,
Yeah.
And that leads on to the other point. The South Australian nurses were only at the general hospital level. Were any of the Australian nurses deployed further forward at what traditionally we think of as the field hospital level? Or was that still out of bounds to women?
Yeah. I've tried to answer this question myself. It's very difficult in the Boer War because of the lines. The actual theatres of war are very unclear. In World War One, you have a dirty, great big trench, one side, the other side. in the Boer War, and also because of these sort of guerrilla tactics of the Boers. There's no clear line. You don't get nurses up in the field areas. There are no field hospitals as such, although the surgeons are actually operating in the field. It was nice, clean air. It was good. So there's no real nurses up there. But that doesn't mean to say some of them during the early days, Colenso, etc., they were in places which were being bombed. A tin camp, stuff like that, yeah.
Thank you. That was very informative, I've got to say. There's another question back there. I was just going to mention, you mentioned the amount of wine that was consumed. The Fiaschi family were winemakers. Still are, in fact.
Yeah, oh, right. It's interesting. Yes, he did organise. The New South Wales people were very organised, I think, prior to the war, and they had their own military contingent, military medical contingent, which included nurses. So they were very much organised. Fiaschi also comes up in World War One. One of the nurses said, he looks very tired. He's not a well man. And he also had some scandals, didn't he? It was sort of wives and second wives and, lots of stuff, yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about documentation of the patient's observations, etc.
Right.
Did they have graph charts? Were they documenting in case notes and stuff like that?
Yes. I know this because I've seen them.
Good.
There's a military medical museum just outside of Aldershot. And it's really interesting to get in there. You have to go to the door. It is an army base, but they have this museum and this archive place inside. You get to the door, the gate, and you have to have ID, and you have to have your photo taken, and you have to wear photo ID for your entire trip while you're inside. And they say, wait a minute, and they get an armed guard to escort you to the next building. So there I was, just kind of tootling along, and I get a boy soldier with a gun to sort of escort me. Look, he was a lovely lad, and I'm trying to make sort of conversation because I've never had a military escort before, and and I said, it's a nice day, and he said, yeah, I wish I was back in bed. Now, within the little museum itself, they do have charts from the Boer War. They don't have blood pressure. They have pulse, reps, temp, but no blood pressure, yeah. And temps were very important because that depended on what they could eat, yeah.
Right at the beginning, when you were talking about their farewell, this is a bit of trivia, you mentioned the presentation of the flowers to the nurses.
I thought it was
now,
nice, yeah.
To follow that one on, I think it was 1922 or 23, there was a rose released in England called Lady Roberts.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's still grown today. So obviously a rose was a very good way to reward nurses.
Yes.
I'm going to ask Dr. Brian Dickey to give a vote of thanks.
This has been delightful and fascinating, and I think we've all learned a lot. Haven't you sensed the politics of gender and also the sense of... there are class issues that are floating about without overplaying them, we've been transported, as we always are in these meetings, to another world, a far less ordered and far less structured world, a world that doesn't do things the way we do things, but they do things differently in the past, don't they?
Yes.
And I think that's always the message. It's been wonderful to hear about women doing good. I was reminded of the great surge of missionaries who were women leaving Australia, and they'd been doing it for about 20 years before the Boer War. And these nurses are very much in that tradition. And it's not to denigrate what the nurses were doing, because they were to some extent putting their lives on the line too. But it's been a great story, and I think we should all thank Caroline for what she had to tell us tonight.